This year I've been presented with the subject and genre of surrealist and experimental film. Although I often found surrealist films to be confusing and in some cases mildly unwatchable, I've been studying David Lynch's Eraserhead, which was just tedious and challenging to watch, Lectures of the Afternoon, which I found had interesting factors, such as the way the same scenes were repeated with different adjustments, which at the time I thought was kind of unnecessary, but after watching more of the surrealist cinema, I started to begin to understand that the director was trying to take the audience out of their comfort zone and take them on a journey through the subconscious and non-linear narrative. Two particular films that caught my attention were Jan Svankmeyer's Gildo, which translate to Food, and also Norman McLaurin's experimental film Neighbours. Both of these films were very inspirational when deciding to use stop frame animation and live action animation. Neighbours also linked to the meanings portrayed in my film, as both of them are based on escalating arguments. I started with frame by frame animation using a Coke can moving across the screen using an iPad and an app called iMotion HD. This app had a feature on it called Onion Skin, which meant I could see the last photo I took, which meant I could line the photos up much better, and I could keep a steady flow going through the whole thing. After producing this, I produced a 24 frame per second, very short animation of 3 spray can caps, so that I could get the feel of having 3 characters moving at the same time. As in my film, I wanted there to be 2 characters, and I feel this was very effective. I then also started experimenting with traditional animation in the form of a flickbook. However, I struggled with the concept and decided to use traditional animation with frame-by-frame animation to make the movement of the characters smoother. Even though I decided to make my animation mostly on 15 frames per second, which isn't as smooth as 24 frames per second. These experiments were helpful as I now knew that live action animation with added visual effects were the way forward for my experimental film. I started with a very simple narrative of a couple's argument over something very small, such as an empty milk carton left inside the fridge. I then went on to draw out a storyboard that I was keen to keep as an open draft so the actors could have their say on what went on. I set out to try and find actors and props to secure a great film. One of my first choices was available, and he was on board after I explained the role he had in the film and dropped off the storyboard to him for him to understand. Unfortunately, my 3 choices for the role of Jane were always unavailable for shooting, so I eventually changed the role to a man, who was actually my second choice for the role of Tom. With a few minor changes to the storyboard to create a relationship of 2 friends and or colleagues, rather than a girlfriend-boyfriend relationship, which was it was kind of hard. Before shooting, I sat down and explained what the 2 were going to do on screen, and after we sat there and spoke for a while, we shot the first half of the film. All went to plan when filming, but although I had sorted out everything we needed, including booking a room to shoot in, filming was still a complex procedure, having to ask my actors to stay still for long periods of time to produce moving visual effects around them. 2 weeks passed and I had edited the first half and added sound effects. However, I wanted something much more fast-paced and physical to add to the conflict, so I introduced the idea of a sword fight, which I made a tremendous difference to the end result. I felt that the toughest part of the whole process was the editing. Although I'm quite good at editing films, I've never had to add my own sound effects instead of dialogue, and to represent movement. So finding specific sounds proved quite difficult, and I ended up with over half an hour's worth of sound effects, which eventually was cut down to produce sound effects for under 2 minutes worth of film. Most sound effects are taken from YouTube, converted and downloaded onto my computer, but many also were recorded with my camera, such as this one I'm using right now to record my voice, and I used it to record sound effects like yeah, that's kind of a pigeon, which I felt gave much more of a personal and experimental theme to the film. I also left certain parts of the film silent simply because sound was not needed to represent any emotion or movement within the shot, and there was no need for it. If I was to do the film again, I think I would have done it outside rather than inside so that I could use a much larger and natural surroundings. I also would probably choose my actors sooner rather than later to ensure that they were available because the subject caused me many weeks of delay. However, I do feel overall my film was successful and it was well received by my audience, especially the visual effects, such as the levitating milk carton, which on every occasion the viewer was surprised and impressed, which was very satisfying. My experimental film was The Sword, and it was written and directed by Louis O'Shea, who is me.